He didn't even let her speak. Harvey Cole looked her up and down, one slow, contemptuous sweep, and shook his head. Right there on the platform, in front of everyone, with her travel bag still in her hand and the train smoke barely cleared from the air. "Too small," he said. Just that. 2 words. Like she was livestock he'd ordered and the shipment came wrong. Eliza Rowan stood completely still. She didn't flinch, didn't beg. But something behind her eyes shifted. The kind of shift that happens when a person decides, in a single heartbeat, that they will never again wait for someone else to decide their worth. She had crossed half a continent for this man's name on a piece of paper, and he dismissed her before she finished her first breath of Wyoming air. If that had been you standing on that platform, what would you have done? Before we go any further, if you've ever been looked at and found lacking before anyone bothered to learn your name, this story is going to hit somewhere deep. Stay with us all the way to the end, because what Eliza Rowan did next changed everything. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now and ring the bell. We put out stories like this every week, and you don't want to miss what's coming. Drop a like, and leave a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to that platform, because the real story is just beginning. The train had been 3 days late out of St. Louis. Eliza Rowan knew this because she'd counted the hours the way a person counts money they can't afford to lose, carefully, with a kind of desperate precision that exhausts you down to the marrow. She'd eaten half portions since Kansas City to make her money last. She'd slept sitting upright in the second-class car, her travel bag wedged between her knees and the seat in front, because she'd heard about women traveling alone and what could happen to an unguarded bag, and by extension, an unguarded woman. She was 26 years old. She had done hard things before. She had worked 12-hour shifts at the Halcott textile mill in Ohio since she was 15, standing at a loom that vibrated through her bones like a second heartbeat. She had watched her mother die in that same town, in a narrow bed in a rented room, and she had handled all of it, the doctor, the burial, the landlord's impatience, without a single person offering to hold her hand through any of it. She knew what difficult felt like. She knew its particular weight. So when the train finally wheezed into the Millhaven depot on a Tuesday morning in early November, Eliza was tired. Yes, tired in the specific way that settles into the body after days of tension and poor sleep. But she was not frightened. She smoothed her coat with both hands, checked that her hair was reasonably pinned, picked up her bag, and walked toward whatever came next with the quiet determination of someone who has learned that hesitation costs more than it saves. The platform was smaller than she expected. A handful of weathered buildings clustered around it like they were trying to keep warm against each other. The sky overhead was the color of pewter, not storming yet, but thinking about it, the way Wyoming skies apparently did for much of the year. She'd read that in a pamphlet. She'd read everything she could find about this territory before agreeing to come, which was more than most women in her position bothered to do. Harvey Cole was not hard to identify. He stood apart from the other men, which she supposed was fitting for a man who owned the largest cattle operation in the valley, or so his letters had implied. He was tall, somewhere in his mid-40s, with the kind of face that might have been handsome once and had since cured itself into something harder, more weathered, more certain of its own judgments. He wore a good coat, not showy, but good. And his boots were clean despite the mud on everything else. A man who kept himself together, she thought. That had seemed like a point in his favor. His letters had not been warm exactly, but they'd been honest. He needed a capable woman to help run a working household. He'd laid out the conditions plainly. The ranch was remote, the winters severe, the work considerable. He wasn't looking for companionship, he'd written. Or rather, he was, but he was practical about it. He needed a partner who could keep up. He'd found the last few years alone increasingly unworkable. She had written back 3 times before agreeing, asking specific questions about the household, the nearest town, whether there was a doctor within reasonable distance, what the domestic arrangements would look like before a formal marriage was settled. His answers had been brief but sufficient. She had made her decision with open eyes. What his letters had not contained, she now realized, was any question about her. He watched her cross the platform toward him, and she saw the calculation happen across his face. Quick, practiced, the way a livestock man prices an animal at a glance. And she felt something contract in her chest. Not fear. Something more precise than fear. the recognition of what was about to happen before it happened. Miss Rowan? Not a question, a confirmation of an unpleasant fact. Mr. Cole. She extended her hand. He shook it, briefly, and then he stepped back and looked at her the way he might study a fence post that had arrived in the wrong size. His gaze moved from her face to her shoulders to her hands, and back up again, and it was unhurried, unashamed, and utterly impersonal, like she wasn't a person standing in front of him, but a problem that had just declared itself. The silence lasted perhaps 4 seconds. It felt considerably longer. "I was expecting someone more substantial," he said. Eliza kept her expression level. "I beg your pardon?" "A mountain winter isn't a parlor game, Miss Rowan. The work I described requires physical capacity." His voice wasn't cruel exactly. It was something worse than cruel. It was indifferent, the way a man speaks when he's already finished with a conversation. "I should have been more specific in my correspondence. That's my error. But I can't take on a woman who'll be more liability than help when the hard months come." The words landed with the particular kind of precision. Not a shout, not an outburst, just a door, closing. She opened her mouth, and then closed it. Because she realized, with a cold, sharp clarity, that he wasn't asking for her response. He wasn't curious about what she might say. He had looked at her and reached his verdict, and in his mind the matter was settled. Anything she said now would simply be noise. He'd have to wait out before she accepted the facts. She had $3.40 in her coat pocket. She had a travel bag containing 2 dresses, a wool skirt, her mother's Bible, a tin of sewing supplies, and a photograph of a lake in Ohio that she'd carried for years because it was the only beautiful thing she'd ever owned that was solely, completely hers. She was standing in a town she'd never seen before, 3 days' travel from the nearest person who knew her name, in November, in Wyoming. She looked at Harvey Cole for a long moment, long enough that he shifted slightly. Not with guilt, she thought, but with mild impatience. "I see," she said, finally. Her voice was quiet and completely steady. "Thank you for meeting me." He nodded, the curt nod of a man who considers graciousness a form of efficiency, and turned and walked back toward the end of the platform where a boy was waiting with his horse. He didn't look back. He didn't hesitate. He had already moved on to the next item in his day. Eliza watched him go. Then she set her bag down on the platform beside her feet, sat down on a wooden bench that was cold enough to bite through her coat, and stared at the middle distance for a moment. Not crying, not because she was determined not to, but because the shock had not quite finished settling into something she could feel yet. It was still just a fact, hovering in front of her, waiting to become real. She had no return ticket. She hadn't bought one, because you didn't buy a return ticket when you were using the last of your savings to start over. It was an extravagance and a jinx in equal measure. She had the money in her pocket and the bag at her feet and nowhere to go and no one to ask. The platform began to empty around her. People drifted away toward horses, toward waiting wagons, toward the small cluster of businesses at the end of the main street. 2 women passed close enough that she heard one of them say something low and brief to the other, and then the sound of a short, quiet laugh. She didn't look up. There was nothing to be gained from looking up. The wind off the mountains came in a long, cold gust that carried grit and the smell of snow still a few weeks away, and Eliza pressed her coat tighter and tried to think. This was what she had always done in difficult moments, tried to think, because panic was expensive and thinking was free. She could ask about work in town. She didn't know what kind of work. She'd never done anything except mill work and household management, and she had no idea what Millhaven's economy required. She could ask whether there was a boarding house that might extend credit to a stranger in difficult circumstances, though she suspected the answer to that would be short and unfriendly. She could go back to the train station window and ask about ticket prices and find out exactly how far $3.40 would take her, and toward what. She was still working through these options when she became aware that she was no longer alone on the platform. She heard them before she saw them, a loose, unsteady quality to the footsteps, the particular clumsiness of men who have been drinking in the late morning and are proud rather than embarrassed by it. 2 of them. Young, mid-20s at most, with the look of seasonal hands who'd come to the end of their writing work and had nothing to do with the gap before they'd find the next position except drink through it. They stopped in front of her bench. "Well," said the taller one, Looks like somebody got left behind. Eliza looked at him. She kept her face neutral. Her hand moved very slightly toward her hat, which was pinned with a steel hat pin 4 inches long with a weighted end. She'd carried it for 3 years, ever since a night shift at the mill had taught her something about the gap between the world as it should be and the world as it was. Just waiting, she said. Flat, not inviting. Waiting for what? Said the second one, and smiled in a way that had nothing friendly in it. She stood up. This surprised them slightly. They'd expected her to stay seated, she could see it, and the surprise bought her 2 seconds, which she used to pick up her bag and take one deliberate step to the side, putting the corner post of the platform overhang at her back. It was an instinct from years of navigating mill floors at shift change. You didn't let people get behind you when there was nowhere to run. You put something solid at your back and you kept your front clear. I'd appreciate it if you'd let me be, she said. Appreciate it, the taller one repeated, tasting the phrase like it was funny. That's a real polite way to talk. I was raised politely. Her fingers closed around the shaft of the hat pin through the fabric of her coat. I'm not above adjusting. Something in the way she said it, the absolute absence of theater in her voice, no tremor, no apology, made the taller one smile flicker, just slightly, just for a half-second. But she saw it, and she filed it. The second one stepped forward, and that was when she pulled the hat pin free and held it low at her side, point forward, in a grip that said she knew exactly what she was holding and what she intended to do with it if circumstances required. I wouldn't, she said, and her voice didn't go up and it didn't go down. Perfectly level. Like she was commenting on weather. She didn't know how long the standoff lasted. It probably wasn't as long as it felt. These things rarely were. What broke it was a sound. Not a dramatic sound, not a gunshot or a shout. Just footsteps. Heavy, uneven, with a particular deliberate rhythm to them. Like someone pacing themselves against a slight drag on one side. The two men heard it too. They looked toward the far end of the platform. The man walking toward them was not large, precisely. He was lean rather than broad, the kind of lean that comes from years of physical work in cold conditions rather than youth. He was somewhere in his 40s, or possibly looked older than he was, with a beard that had grown past intention into something it had simply decided to become on its own. His coat was working gear, not rough but worn to his shape through years of use, and he walked with a slight hitch in his right leg that he didn't apologize for or try to disguise. He just worked around it the way you work around a door that doesn't hang quite right but still opens if you know the angle. He didn't say anything when he reached them. He stopped about 6 feet away and looked at the two men with an expression that was not angry and not threatening. It was something harder to categorize, a kind of absolute absence of concern about what they might do, the way a man looks at a situation he has already assessed and found uncomplicated. The taller of the two men looked at him for a moment. Mercer, he said finally. The man named Mercer nodded once, minimally. Another moment passed. Then the two men exchanged a brief private communication, the wordless kind that drunk people manage when they've been drinking together long enough. And the taller one shrugged and they both walked away down the platform steps without another word, without hurrying, but without looking back either. Eliza watched them go. Then she turned and looked at the man standing 4 feet away. He was looking at her hat, at the pin she was still holding. You had it handled, he said. Not a compliment, not condescension, a straightforward observation. I did, she agreed. She slid the pin back through the hat and resettled it on her head with 2 careful adjustments. He studied her for another moment in the quiet, unhurried way of a man who had learned patience through years of waiting in cold places. Cole's woman, he said. I was, she said, for approximately 4 minutes. Something crossed his face that might have been the ghost of something almost amused. It was hard to tell. His face had been weathered past the point where small expressions left clear traces. He turned you away. He did. Because you're small. Those were his exact words, yes. She kept her voice level, but she was watching him carefully now, trying to read what category of person he was, what this conversation was building toward, because experience had taught her that conversations initiated by men who just watched you nearly get cornered by 2 drunks were rarely purely sociable. He nodded slowly, as if this information confirmed something he'd suspected. Then he looked off toward the far end of the street for a moment, and she could see him thinking. Not performing thought, but actually turning something over, working through its angles. I've got a homestead, he said, up the mountain. 3 hours ride from here, more in snow. She waited. My leg's a problem in winter. I trap through December, January, but there's work at the homestead I can't manage and also do the trapping. I had a man last year. He left in October. What kind of work? She said. He turned back and looked at her directly. Everything that keeps a place alive. Fire, food stores, water when the upper creek freezes. Mending, whatever needs doing. It's not comfortable work. I'm familiar with uncomfortable work. He accepted this without reacting to it. I can't pay much. Enough to get you somewhere decent in spring, if you want to go. I'll provide food and shelter through the winter. It would be a working arrangement. He paused. Not a married one. She absorbed this carefully. You don't know anything about me. I know you didn't run from those two, he said. I know you thought about where to put your back before you stood up. Those are things most people don't know to do. He said it the way he said everything else, like a report, not a speech. I'm not saying I know you. I'm saying I watched you for about 3 minutes and you didn't do anything stupid. Eliza looked at this man, his scarred hands, his worn coat, his uneven stance, his face that gave away almost nothing, and she tried to do the arithmetic of risk in her head. $3.40. A town that had watched her get rejected on a platform and looked away. November in Wyoming and a sky that was thinking seriously about snow. A stranger who had walked toward a bad situation rather than away from it, who had asked her what kind of work, and then told her the truth about the conditions, and who had not once, in the 4 minutes she'd known him, looked at her the way Harvey Cole had looked at her on that platform. It wasn't enough. A reasonable person would have said it wasn't nearly enough. But Eliza Rowan had not arrived in Wyoming looking for a reasonable choice. She'd arrived looking for a chance. And chances, in her experience, didn't come wrapped in certainty. They came wrapped in exactly this: a stranger's word, a cold platform, a sky about to turn, and the terrible clarifying freedom of having nothing left to lose. When do you leave? She said. He looked at her steadily. Hour. I've got supplies to get. She picked up her bag. Then let's not waste the hour. Something shifted in his expression. That same ghost of something, barely there. He turned and started walking, the uneven rhythm of his step unhurried and consistent. And Eliza Rowan, who had crossed half a continent to start over and arrived to find the door locked, picked up her bag and followed a stranger she didn't know into a winter she wasn't prepared for, because she had looked at every other option and found them smaller than her fear. The platform behind her was empty by the time she reached the steps. Millhaven didn't watch her go. It had already forgotten she'd arrived. She didn't look back. There was nothing behind her now, and looking back at nothing was a habit she had never been able to afford. The supply store in Millhaven was a narrow building that smelled of leather and linseed oil and the particular dusty sweetness of dried grain stored in burlap. Eliza followed Silas Mercer through the door and stayed close without hovering, because she understood instinctively that this was not a man who wanted to be trailed like a shadow. He moved through the space with the efficiency of someone who had done this exact errand many times and knew precisely what he needed and where it was and how much it would cost. And he didn't browse or hesitate or change his mind about anything. She watched him work through his list: flour, salt pork, dried beans, a tin of lamp oil, a coil of rope, 2 boxes of rifle cartridges. And she watched the man behind the counter watch him, and she learned something from that too. The storekeeper was polite and prompt and kept his eyes on the transaction and didn't make small talk. People in this town, she was beginning to understand, handled Silas Mercer the way you handled a large, potentially unpredictable dog that had never actually bitten anyone, with careful, consistent courtesy and no sudden movements. When Silas had finished his order, he turned to her without preamble. Anything you need for the winter? She looked at the shelves for a moment. She had $3.40. I'll be careful with it, she said. I didn't ask you to be careful with it. I asked what you need. She studied him. He was looking at her with the same level, waiting expression he'd used on the platform. Not impatient, but not indulging her either. Like he'd said a thing and meant it, and was simply waiting for her to catch up with him. Heavier wool stockings, she said, if they have them, and a good pair of work gloves. Mine are for Ohio winters, not this. He turned back to the counter. Add those. And a second pair of the gloves. He paused. And whichever coat in the back has the best lining. Her size. Eliza opened her mouth. We can settle accounts in spring when there's something to settle them with, he said, before she could speak. Not generously. Just factually, the way you'd explain that water runs downhill. She closed her mouth. She was going to have to get used to the way this man communicated, which was without ceremony and without any of the social lubrication that most people applied to difficult subjects to make them easier to swallow. He just said the thing. It was disorienting, and she admitted privately, something of a relief after a morning of being assessed and dismissed without a word spoken directly to her face. They loaded his horse, a heavy-built gray with a patient disposition and ears that swiveled independently like two small radar dishes, and a mule that waited beside it with the bored resignation of an animal that has accepted its life and made its peace with it. Silas moved efficiently between the two animals, distributing weight with the automatic competence of long practice, and Eliza handed things up without being asked because she could see what needed doing, and doing it was easier than standing there looking useless. When everything was secured, he stood back and looked at the load and made a small adjustment to one of the packs, a tug and a retie that took maybe 10 seconds, and then he looked at her. "You ride?" "I've ridden," she said. "I'm not exceptional at it." "The mule's easier than she looks. Just don't pull her head around tight when we're on the narrow parts. She knows the trail better than you will." Eliza looked at the mule. The mule looked back at her with the kind of steady, centuries-deep patience that only mules achieve. "Good," Eliza said, and she meant it. They left Millhaven at 10:30 in the morning, riding north out of town on a track that was still reasonably wide and reasonably flat, with the mountains ahead of them, looking close in the clear air and impossibly far in the way that mountains always look when you're still at the bottom. The sky had lightened slightly but held its pewter quality, and the air had the particular dry coldness of altitude, not the damp cold of Ohio rivers, but something sharper, cleaner, that got into the lungs and made the breath feel almost useful. Silas rode ahead without rushing. His horse had a ground-eating walk that covered distance without drama, and the mule fell in behind automatically, maintaining the gap with no input from Eliza, who found her job in these first miles was mainly not to interfere. She had time to think. This was either an advantage or a problem, depending on the subject matter. She thought about the telegraph office in Millhaven, which she'd seen but not used. She had no one to telegraph. Her mother was 3 years gone. Her friend Clara from the mill had moved to Pittsburgh, and they'd lost contact over 18 months of Clara's increasingly sparse letters. There was her cousin Edmund in Indiana, who she'd met twice and who she was fairly certain would be of limited practical help even if she reached him, which she couldn't. She had crossed the country and arrived at a destination that had rejected her and had followed a stranger into the mountains, and there was no one in the world who knew where she was. She turned this fact over and looked at it from several angles and found that it was genuinely frightening, but not as frightening as she'd have expected, possibly because she'd been effectively alone for several years already, and being alone in Wyoming was not categorically different from being alone in Ohio, except in terms of geography and temperature and the presence of one taciturn mountain trapper riding 15 feet ahead of her. At some point in the second hour, the track narrowed and began to climb. This was where the mule's superior knowledge of the situation became genuinely valuable. The animal picked her line through the switchbacks with a confidence that Eliza chose to trust absolutely, because the alternative was to second-guess a creature that had been navigating this terrain since before Eliza had any idea Wyoming existed, and that seemed like poor judgment. She focused on balance and on keeping her weight even and on not looking too long at the drop to the left of the trail, which was doing that thing where mountains show you the consequence of inattention and then dare you to look away. Silas, ahead of her, rode without apparent concern. She noticed that on the steeper sections he shifted his weight slightly forward and his right hand dropped to his thigh, the leg, in what looked like an automatic half-conscious gesture, like touching a worry stone. It was there, and then it wasn't. And he didn't slow, and he didn't speak, and she filed it away alongside everything else she was collecting about this man, building a picture from the pieces because the alternative was following him into a winter wilderness knowing nothing at all. They stopped once, briefly, at a place where a creek crossed the trail and both animals wanted to drink. Silas dismounted with a practiced economy of movement that accommodated his leg without calling attention to it, a kind of private choreography he'd worked out long ago, and stood beside his horse while it drank and looked back the way they'd come. Eliza could see Millhaven from here, or what she thought was Millhaven. A small arrangement of shapes in the valley below, smoke rising from one or two chimneys, the whole thing looking from this height like a sketch rather than a real place. Small, impermanent, unimpressive. "How long have you been in this territory?" she asked. He looked at her over the horse's back. 11 years. You came from somewhere else. Pennsylvania, he said, a long time ago. She waited to see if he'd continue. He didn't. What brought you here? He picked up his reins. Same thing brings most people. Somewhere else stopped working. She thought about this as they remounted and continued up the trail. It was a more honest answer than most people would have given. Most people would have said opportunity, or land, or adventure, the words people used when the real words were too personal to hand to a stranger. He'd said somewhere else stopped working, which was precise and unglamorous and exactly true. She supposed, with a small cold jolt of recognition, that it was true for her as well. The homestead appeared without announcement, which was somehow fitting. One moment there was trail and timber and the sound of wind in the upper branches, and then the trees thinned on one side, and there it was, a log cabin that sat with its back against a rocky rise, as though the mountain had simply grown it there. It was not large. It was not charming. It was a structure built entirely around the single requirement of surviving in a place that would otherwise kill you, and it wore this purpose openly and without apology. There was a shed attached to one side, and beyond it a smaller outbuilding that she would later learn served as a smokehouse. A woodpile ran the length of the cabin's north wall, already substantial. He'd been at it since September, she'd learn, and a lean-to beside the shed held the beginnings of his trapping equipment, steel traps hanging in lines like a strange and lethal laundry. Silas dismounted in the yard and began unloading without commentary, and Eliza did the same on her side, working the knots loose on the pack straps with fingers that had gone numb in the last hour of riding and were now just barely reporting back on their activity. She carried the first load inside. The cabin interior was functional and spare in the way of a place maintained by a person who lives alone and has no interest in performance. A cast-iron stove occupied one corner, its pipe running up through the ceiling. A rough-built table with two chairs. Shelves along one wall holding the kind of orderly supply inventory she recognized from mill dormitory kitchens. Labeled, sorted, positioned for quick access. A sleeping area partitioned from the main room by a heavy curtain hung on a wire. Another bunk built against the opposite wall, clearly not the one he used, with a folded blanket on it that looked like it had been placed there recently and with more deliberation than the rest of the cabin suggested. She set down her load and looked at the bunk and then at the curtain and understood the arrangement without needing it explained. When Silas came in with the second load, she was already feeding wood into the stove from the stack beside it, because the cabin was cold, and because standing there waiting for him to instruct her in the obvious was not something she intended to make a habit of. He set the supplies on the table and watched her for a moment without speaking. "The flue damper's stiff," he said. "You have to push it past the catch. It'll release." She found the damper, felt the catch, pushed past it. The draft opened, and the fire began to pull properly. "I'll remember," she said. He started sorting the supplies onto the shelves with the same systematic efficiency he'd shown in the store. She moved to help, and he shifted slightly to give her access to the shelf space without making a production of it. And they worked through the unpacking in a silence that was not uncomfortable exactly, but was the particular silence of two strangers who have agreed to occupy a shared space and are in the process of working out the geometry of it. "Rules," he said after a while. Not harshly, just the word. "Go ahead," she said. "The rifle stays loaded and on the wall hook by the door. Not because anything is likely, but because in the time it takes to load it, likely becomes something else. You know how to fire a rifle?" "I know the principle. I've done it twice." "We'll go over it tomorrow." He continued shelving. "Woodbox needs to stay full. It's not a suggestion. If the fire dies in a real cold snap, the pipes freeze, and once the pipes freeze, you've got about 4 hours before the cabin temperature becomes a problem. I've seen it happen." "Understood." "Water from the upper creek until December, then usually the lower one stays open longer. I'll show you both. Don't go further than the marked trees on the east side. I've got traps set out there, and if you don't know the lines, you'll find them the wrong way." She looked at him. "How far does your territory run?" "About 2 miles east, 1.5 miles north. I'll walk it with you this week while we still can." I'd want that, she said. He glanced at her. Just a brief glance, the kind that registers something without commenting on it. Most people would have said yes to be agreeable. I said I'd want it because I actually would. Knowing the boundaries seems important. He was quiet for a moment. Yeah, he said finally. It is. That night, Eliza lay on the bunk in the dark, listening to the sounds of the mountain settling into itself. The wood of the cabin contracting in the dropping temperature. Something moving in the trees at a distance. The low creak of the lean-to in the wind. And she ran through the arithmetic of her situation with the steady, practical focus that had always been her primary survival tool. She was in a remote cabin in Wyoming mountains with a man she'd known for 7 hours. She had essentially no money and no way to leave until spring. She was entirely dependent on his knowledge of this place and this territory, and he was entirely unknown to her except for the evidence of the past 7 hours, which consisted of he'd walked toward trouble rather than away from it. He'd told her the conditions accurately and without softening them. He'd bought her a coat and called it an advance against spring rather than charity, and he'd given her a separate sleeping area without it being requested or discussed. These were not small things. They were not certainty either. She turned onto her side and pulled the blanket, which was heavy and wool and smelled of cedar, up to her chin, and decided that certainty was a luxury she'd done without before and could continue to do without. What she had was evidence, and evidence was enough to work with. Sleep came faster than she expected, and when it did, it was deep and without dreams. The first week was the hardest, and not for the reasons she'd expected. She had expected the cold. She had expected the work, the hauling of water, the splitting of kindling, the endless feeding of the stove, the cooking over an open flame with limited utensils and ingredients that required planning rather than improvisation. She'd expected physical difficulty, and she found it thoroughly in the muscles of her back and arms and in her hands, which ached at the end of every day with a specific and impressive persistence. What she hadn't fully expected was Silas Mercer. Not his temper. He didn't seem to have one in the conventional sense. Not his demands. They were practical and consistently explained, and when she did something in a way he'd have done differently, he said so once and then let it rest. What she hadn't expected was the particular difficulty of learning someone through their silences, because Silas communicated largely in the gaps between words, and understanding what the gaps meant required a kind of sustained attention that was its own form of labor. On the third day, she asked him about the leg. They were outside in the late afternoon, the light already failing at the edges of the tree line, and he was showing her how to check the traps on the north line, how to reset the trigger without losing fingers, which he demonstrated with the careful patience of someone who had learned this precision through at least one painful educational experience. She was paying very close attention. "What happened to it?" she asked, when they'd finished the last trap on that section. He straightened and looked at where the trail ran back toward the cabin. "Rockfall, 6 years ago. I was setting lines too close to a runoff channel and the spring thaw came 2 weeks early." He paused. "My own error. How long were you out here alone with it?" "A beat. 3 days before I could get down to town." She absorbed this without speaking, because the thing to say was something like, "That's awful," or "I can't imagine," and she understood instinctively that neither of those were what he needed or wanted. What he'd told her was a fact. She treated it as one. "Does it fail on you?" she said. "Like, buckle, without warning?" He looked at her then, and she could see the question surprised him slightly. Not the content of it, but the angle. "Sometimes. In the extreme cold, more. The muscles around it cramp and then the whole thing goes unreliable." "What do you do when that happens out on the lines?" "Stop. Wait for it to ease. Get home carefully." He was still watching her. "Why?" "Because if it happens when you're 2 miles out and the temperature drops while you're waiting, that's a problem I should know about and have a plan for," she said. "That's not me being morbid. That's the same reason you told me about the rifle and the water supply." I was quiet for a moment that went on just long enough that she wondered if she'd misjudged the register of the conversation. "I've got a second rifle," he said, "the older one. If I'm not back when I said I'd be back by more than an hour, you take it and come on the trail." He paused. "But you'd need to know the trails well enough first." "Then we'd better finish walking them," she said. They walked the east boundary the next morning and the south line the morning after that, and by the end of the week she knew the property well enough to move through it in poor light, which he told her was the relevant standard, not daylight. Emergencies don't schedule themselves for good visibility, he said, and she thought, no, they really don't. In the evenings, they ate at the table together and sometimes talked and sometimes didn't, and she learned to read the difference between his silence when he was tired and his silence when he was thinking and his silence when he was uncomfortable, which was rarer but had a distinct quality, a slight increase in stillness, like an animal that's heard something and is deciding whether it's a threat. He was uncomfortable, she noticed, when she thanked him for things. The third time it happened, she'd thanked him for showing her the correct way to bank the stove for overnight so the fire would last till morning. He set down his coffee cup and said, "You don't have to do that." "Do what?" "Thank me. For things that are just practical. For things that matter to both of us." She considered this. "It's polite." "It's a transaction," he said, not unkindly. "You're here because we need each other to get through the winter. That's not a favor. It's an arrangement. You don't thank someone for their half of an arrangement." She looked at him across the table and thought, this is a man who has been alone for a very long time. And being alone for a very long time does something to a person's relationship with ordinary social currency. It makes them suspicious of it, or impatient with it, or both. "All right," she said, "no thank yous." "No thank yous," he agreed, and picked his cup back up. She gave it 4 days and then said thank you when he split the top off a frozen water barrel for her without being asked, because she was constitutionally incapable of receiving something useful without acknowledging it, and she felt that if he truly objected, he'd say so, and she'd deal with it then. He made a sound that might have been the most minimal exhalation of something almost like amusement, and didn't say a word. In the second week, she made her first serious mistake. She'd been hauling water from the upper creek, 2 trips, the buckets heavy enough to make her arms shake by the second carry. And on the return from the third trip, which she'd undertaken because the water barrel still wasn't full, and she couldn't stand the thought of coming up short, her foot went through a patch of ice over soft ground and she went down hard, both buckets tipping and most of the water going into the snow. She sat there for a moment. Her right knee had hit something under the ice, a rock, she thought. And the pain was immediate and specific and not, she was fairly sure, anything serious. But it announced itself with the kind of authority that requires acknowledgement before you can move past it. She got up. She picked up the buckets. She went back for a third trip, and this time she tested the ice with a stick first. When she came inside, Silas was at the table fletching an arrow. He used a short bow for small game, quieter than the rifle in certain conditions. And he looked up and saw her favoring her right leg slightly, because she wasn't quite successfully hiding it yet. "What happened?" he said. "Ice over soft ground. I went through it. I'm fine." He set down the arrow and the fletching. "Let me see." "I said I'm fine." "I heard you." He pulled back the other chair from the table with one foot and waited. She sat down with slightly more control than she felt and pushed up her trouser leg. She'd changed into men's work trousers on day 2 because they were warmer and more practical, and there was no one here to have opinions about it, and looked at the knee. It was swelling, not dramatically, but definitively. Silas crouched in front of her and examined it with his hands, pressing carefully at the edges of the joint, watching her face rather than the knee while he did it. "Tell me when." "There," she said, when he pressed along the outer edge. "Not the joint, just the muscle." He sat back on his heels. "I've got comfrey poultice. You'll want it tonight, or by tomorrow it'll be stiff." "I don't know how to make that." "I do." He stood. "There's a small crock on the second shelf, labeled, 'Bring it.'" She brought it, and he mixed the poultice with the efficient confidence of someone who has been his own doctor for many years out of geographic necessity, and he showed her how to apply it and how to wrap it, and when she tried to take over the process, because she didn't love sitting there being tended to, she found it deeply uncomfortable. He simply held the bandaging strip out of her reach without comment until she sat back. "I lost 3 days last winter," he said, tying off the wrap, "because I didn't take a bruised ankle seriously for the first 2 days, and then it seized and I couldn't walk on it at all. You take it seriously now." "I understand the logic," she said. "Good." He stood and put the crock back on the shelf. The stick idea was right. Use it on the whole path, not just the spots that look suspicious. On this mountain, ice doesn't always look like ice. She filed this. "Anything else I'm doing wrong?" He thought about it, which she appreciated. He was not the kind of person who said no reflexively to seem polite. The fire, he said. You load it too heavy in the mornings. More wood isn't more heat. It's more smoke and a faster burn. Less wood, better placed, is more heat for longer. Show me. He showed her. She adjusted. The next morning she got it right on the first try, and she didn't tell him this because she'd internalized his point about transactions. But she was quietly and disproportionately pleased with herself in a way that no one else in the world knew about, which was fine. By the third week, the routine had taken on a shape. She was up before him, which he'd neither requested nor expected but accepted without comment. By the time he came out from behind the curtain, the stove was built up properly and the coffee was on. She'd found the coffee supply on her second day and considered it a non-negotiable line item in any survival situation. And she'd usually have started on whatever needed doing first outdoors before the temperature dropped further as the morning progressed. He left for the trapping lines mid-morning, carrying his pack and the rifle, walking the trail with his uneven but consistent rhythm. And she watched him go the first 3 times with a specific, focused attention, committing the image to some practical part of her brain that was cataloging contingencies. Because she knew, and he knew she knew, that the leg was a variable. Not a crisis, not yet, but a variable. While he was out, she worked this homestead. She had to admit to herself in the privacy of her own thoughts, a remarkable amount of work for one person. Not impossible, she could manage it, but right at the edge of manageable, which meant there was no room for inefficiency. She learned to combine tasks. The walk to the water creek became a check of the near tree line for deadfall that could be dragged back for firewood. The time while the evening meal cooked became mending time. She repaired 2 of his shirts, a pair of wool socks, and a cracked axe handle, and when she set the axe handle on the table beside his place at supper, he picked it up and turned it in his hands and said, "You've done this before." "My mother's household didn't run itself," she said. He set the handle down and nodded. It wasn't quite the response she might have wanted, but she'd stopped translating his nods and pauses into the vocabulary of warmer men. He meant what he said, without addition or subtraction, and a nod meant the thing was noted and good. She was slowly and imperfectly learning his language. He was, she suspected, doing the same with hers, though he'd have been the last person to put it in those terms. It was in the 4th week that she found the carvings. She'd been reorganizing the supply shelf to make space for the dried venison he'd brought back from a particularly productive day out, and she'd moved a crate from under the bottom shelf and found, behind where the crate had sat, a small collection of carved figures, animals mostly, done in a pale-colored wood she didn't immediately recognize. A deer, a hawk, something that was either a wolf or a very ambitious dog, a fish. They were small, each one no bigger than her palm, and they were good. Not decorative good, but considered good, each one capturing something essential about the animal, the way a person draws when they're not drawing for anyone but themselves. She picked up the hawk and looked at it. The detail in the feathers was extraordinary. Not every feather, but the ones that mattered for the sense of the thing, the ones that told you how it moved. She put it back carefully and replaced the crate and didn't say anything about it that evening at supper. But she thought about it. Because the man who made careful, considered, private small things in the dark hours of winter evenings was not quite the same man as the one she'd been building in her catalog of observations, or rather, he was the same man, but more of him. And more of him was, she sat with the word for a moment, examining it, more of him was someone she found genuinely interesting, not as a benefactor or a survival mechanism or a provider of practical information about Wyoming winters. Interesting. This was new information, and she wasn't entirely sure what to do with it. She put it where she put most things that didn't have an immediate practical application, to the side, where she could see it without having to deal with it, to be picked up again when the moment was right. Outside, the temperature fell 14 degrees in a single night, and by morning the upper creek was solid and the woodpile had become something she was going to need to think about more urgently. And the mountain reminded her, in the way mountains did, that the luxury of thinking about anything other than survival was one that had to be continuously re-earned. She was outside with the axe at first light, and when Silas came out an hour later, the wood box was half full, and she was stacking the second row, her breath fogging in the cold with the rhythm of the work. And he stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at her, and then looked at the sky, which was low and gray and building. "Storm tonight," he said. "I figured," she said without stopping, "we should get the animals in." Already started the shed. He looked at the shed door, which was open, and at the smaller of his two horses, which was visible inside. He looked back at her. When did you do that? Before the wood. Animals first. Something shifted in his expression. Something she was getting slightly better at reading, a quality of reassessment, like a man updating a calculation. He came down the steps and picked up the second axe from beside the woodpile and started splitting alongside her without being asked. And they worked through the morning in a rhythm that was almost, but not quite, comfortable. The kind of rhythm you find with someone when you've been occupying the same small space long enough that your movements have started to anticipate each other, to leave room for each other, without either of you having decided to do it. The storm came in at dusk, as promised, hard and serious and entirely without apology. They were inside by then, the fire built high, the animals secure, the water barrel full, the wood box stacked to the top, and an additional pile stacked inside the door against the wall, which had been her idea, and which Silas had implemented without commentary, which she'd come to understand meant he thought it was a good idea. The sound of the wind against the log walls was like a pressure rather than a noise, present in the body, not just the ears. The lamp threw a circle of yellow light that made the space feel smaller and more immediate, and outside the window there was only black and the driving white of the snow. Silas was sharpening his knife at the table, slow and methodical, the stone making a sound like a whisper on a loop. Eliza was mending a hole in the wool blanket from her bunk. It had been a small hole on day one, and she'd been intending to get to it and had not gotten to it, and now it was the size of her palm and instructive about the cost of delayed maintenance. After a while he said, without looking up from the stone, "You're not what I expected." She kept her eyes on the mending. "What did you expect?" "Someone who'd have asked me to take her back down the mountain by day 3. She pulled the thread through. "Was that a possibility you were prepared for?" "I'd have done it if I had to," he said. "It would have cost me the winter. I'd have managed." "I wasn't going to ask," she said. "I know that now." She tied off the section she was working and examined it in the lamplight. "What did you see in me on the platform, specifically? Because you made a decision in about 5 minutes." He considered this with the same seriousness he applied to everything. "You didn't play helpless," he said. "When those two came at you, you stood up and moved your back to the post before you did anything else. That's not something most people would think to do. Most people would either freeze or run." He turned the knife and started on the other side of the blade. "And when I offered you the arrangement, you asked about the work before you asked about anything else. Not the pay, not the safety. The work. The work was what would tell me if it was survivable." "Yes," he said. "That's why it was the right question." She looked at him across the table. The lamp between them threw shadows upward that made his face look older than it was, all the angles deeper. "You've met people who ask the wrong questions." "I've met people who asked no questions at all," he said. "They generally didn't last." She thought about Harvey Cole, who had asked her no questions either, who had looked and decided without data. She thought about the way he'd turned his back on that platform, and how it had felt less like rejection and more like a revision, a door shutting on one version of her life and leaving the mechanism intact for another one to open elsewhere. She didn't say any of this. Some things were better kept to yourself until you understood them fully, and she didn't understand this one fully yet. Outside, the storm drove against the cabin and the fire crackled in the stove and the lamp burned quietly between them, and neither of them spoke for a long time after that, and the silence was not empty. It was the silence of a space that two people have begun, without quite meaning to share. The knife and the mending, the lamp and the storm. The mountain, patient and enormous and completely indifferent, pressing in from every side. She put another log on the fire at 10 o'clock and went to her bunk, and she lay in the dark and listened to the storm work at the walls. And she thought, "I am here. I am here, and I am all right. And tomorrow there will be work to do, and I will do it." It was not a small thing to be able to say that and mean it. She was still working out exactly how large a thing it was. The storm that had moved in that first serious night turned out to be a rehearsal. December came down off the peaks like something that had been waiting all year to make its point. The temperature dropped to levels that Eliza had no prior reference for. Not the damp, bone-settling cold of Ohio winters, but a dry, absolute cold that was almost conceptual in its intensity, that made the air itself feel brittle, that turned every exhaled breath into a small disappearing cloud and made metal surfaces burn the skin on contact. The upper creek had been solid since the third week of November. By the first week of December, the lower one, which Silas had told her usually stayed open longer, was thickening at the edges with ice that got wider every morning. She adapted. This was the word she used for it privately. Adapted. Because the alternative words were struggled and barely managed, and those were true, but not useful, and she'd long since learned the difference between true and useful. She'd changed the water routine within 2 days of the lower creek starting to close, knocking a channel through the thickening ice each morning with the back of the axe before the day's temperature made the ice too thick to break cleanly. It added 20 minutes to the morning water run and required her to go out earlier, before full light, which meant navigating the trail in that flat, gray pre-dawn dark with the lamp in one hand and the axe in the other, and her footing tested at every step. She fell twice in the first week. Once she went down hard enough that she sat in the snow for a moment, simply taking inventory, knee, hip, wrist, before deciding that everything worked and getting back up. The second time she caught herself on one knee and stayed there for a count of 3, then rose again more slowly and rerouted around a section of trail that was icing in a pattern she hadn't accounted for. She began carrying a second small axe on those morning runs, shorter handled, lighter, tucked through her belt. Not for the ice. For the stretch of trail that ran through the east-facing draw where the timber thinned, and once she'd found clear prints in the snow that Silas had examined later and identified as mountain lion without any particular drama in his voice, which had been somehow more alarming than if he'd reacted with urgency. "Does it come close to the cabin?" she'd asked. "Hasn't in 4 years," he'd said. "Doesn't mean it won't." She'd started carrying the axe. Silas was out on the lines most days through early December, working in a methodical rotation that covered the territory efficiently. He moved the lines further out as December deepened, following the animal patterns as the weather pushed game into different corridors, and this meant longer days away from the cabin and returns in the dark more often than not. She'd worked out a system. If he wasn't back by the time the evening meal was ready, she held it at low heat on the back of the stove and went on with her evening. And if he wasn't back within an hour of that, she put on the heavy coat and took the older rifle from the wall. He'd come back 4 times to find her already partway up the north trail with it, and each time he'd emerged from the tree line with the pack on his back and the leg working its uneven rhythm and seen her there with the rifle, and each time he'd said nothing about it except to nod, and she'd turned around and walked back with him, and they'd eaten late at the table. The 5th time he came back limping harder than usual. She heard him on the porch before he came in. She could tell his step by the rhythm of it now, the way you learn a particular sound when it matters to distinguish it from other sounds, and something in the pattern was wrong. Too slow. Too deliberate, even for him. She went to the door and opened it before he reached it. He was upright. She registered this first with a relief she didn't display. Upright and moving under his own power, the pack still on his back. But his right hand was gripping the porch post, and his jaw was set in the particular way she'd come to associate with pain that he was managing rather than pain that had been resolved. "The leg," she said, "went out on the north slope, coming down the switchback." He came inside and stood by the table and set the pack down with a careful, controlled movement that told her the standing itself was work. "Sit down." "I need to—" "The rifle is on the hook and the fire is built and the water barrel is full," she said. "Sit down." He sat down. She could see the relief of it move through him even though he didn't show it in his face, a fractional release of tension in his shoulders, the specific loosening of a person who'd been holding themselves together through the final leg of a difficult thing and could now stop. She crouched in front of him and went through the same process he'd used on her knee weeks before, pressing carefully at the margins, watching his face, working her way around the joint until she found the places that made his breath change. The muscle along the outside of the knee was in a full cramp, rigid under her fingers, and when she pressed into it, he made a sound that wasn't quite a word and wasn't quite not one. "How long has it been like this?" "Since the switchback, 2 hours maybe." 2 hours, she repeated, and kept the rest of what she thought about that out of her voice. "You walked 2 hours on this." "I didn't have an alternative." "No," she said. "You didn't." She stood and went to the supply shelf for the comfrey crock, and then reconsidered and went to the smaller crate under the bottom shelf where he kept what she'd come to think of as his medical stores. More comprehensive than she'd expected, stocked with the systematic practicality of someone who had been the only available medical resource in his own life for over a decade. She found the wintergreen oil and the flannel strips and brought them back to the table. "This is going to hurt," she said. "I know what it is." "I know you know. I'm telling you anyway." She worked the muscle for 20 minutes, which was not pleasant for either of them. He gripped the table edge and said nothing, and she kept her hand steady and her pressure consistent and her eyes on the work, because looking at his face while she was causing him pain in order to help him was something she didn't have the good category for yet, and she chose to simply not do it. When the cramp began to release, not all at once, but in stages, like a fist slowly unclenching, she felt it under her hands and kept the pressure until it finished, and then wrapped the knee with the flannel strips the way he'd taught her, snug but not tight. "You need to stay off it for 2 days minimum," she said. He looked at her. "I know," she said. "The lines. The north set needs to be checked by tomorrow evening. If I don't clear the catches, I lose half the week's work, and whatever's in the trap gets at the furs before I can retrieve them." She sat back on her heels and thought about this for a moment. She thought about it the same way she thought about every problem up here. Not from the angle of whether she could do it, but from the angle of how. "Walk me through the north line, all of it. Every point, every trap, every marker." He looked at her steadily. "It's 4 miles round trip in December." "I know what month it is," she said. "Walk me through the line." He did. It took the better part of an hour, him describing each waypoint and each trap location and each reset procedure in the careful, systematic way he approached everything, and her asking questions at every point where the description left room for ambiguity, and him answering them without impatience. By the end of it, she'd drawn a rough map on the back of a flour sack with a charred stick, which was the best writing implement available, and she had it clear enough in her head that she could follow it. "The reset on the number 3 trap is tricky," he said. "The trigger mechanism is worn. You showed me the worn one on the east line. This one's worse." He described the adjustment. She made him describe it twice. "You'll know you've got it right when the plate sits flush. If it's off by even a little, the trap springs immediately when you release it." "How immediately?" "Immediately." He met her eyes. "You keep your hands clear of the mechanism until the plate is flush and your fingers are completely out of the set zone. If you have any doubt, leave it unset. One trap is not worth fingers." "Understood," she said. "Eliza." He said her name, and it was the first time he'd used it without a practical prefix. Not Eliza, the coffee, or Eliza. Come look at this. Just her name, plain. "The north slope is exposed. The wind comes off the ridge there with nothing to break it. You'll be colder than you've been yet." "Then I'll dress accordingly," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Take the rifle. The full one, not the older one. And if the sky goes gray before you're 2/3 through the line, turn around and come back. The furs aren't worth a ground blizzard." "What does the sky look like before a ground blizzard?" He described it. She listened with the focused attention she'd been applying to everything he told her since day one, because she'd understood from the beginning that in this place, information was the thing that kept you alive and ignorance was the thing that didn't. She left the next morning before full light. The cold on the north slope was a different proposition than the cold around the cabin, and she'd thought she understood cold by now. The wind came off the ridge exactly as he'd described, unbroken and insistent, pressing against every gap in her clothing with the dedicated persistence of something with an agenda. The new coat from Millhaven was good, genuinely good, and she was grateful for it in a specific and visceral way that she tucked away to think about later. She worked the line methodically, moving from marker to marker, clearing each trap and resetting it according to what she'd been told, and she was calm until she hit the number 3 trap and understood immediately what he'd meant by worse. The trigger mechanism was worn past the point of reliable behavior. It had a quality of potential energy barely contained, like a clock spring overwound, and she crouched in front of it in the wind and took her time. No hurrying, no assuming. She studied it the way he would, turned it in the available light, found the angle, worked the plate down with 2 fingers of her right hand while her left stayed completely clear, and when the plate sat flush, she withdrew both hands slowly, and then sat back in the snow and breathed for a count of 4. The trap held. She stood up. The rest of the line went cleanly, and she was back to the cabin with 2 hours of usable light still left, which was better than she'd planned for. She brought back what the traps had taken. Not as much as a normal day, but reasonable given the conditions. And she laid them out in the shed the way he'd taught her, noting which were which, and then she went inside. He was at the table. He'd been up. She could tell by the wood box, which was fuller than she'd left it, and was now sitting with the legs stretched out and the carving tools on the table, a piece of pale wood turning in his hands. He looked up when she came in. She hung the rifle on the hook, unwrapped her scarf, put her gloves on the shelf above the stove. "Number 3 trap held," she said. 2 from the north section, 1 from the east marker. He set the wood down. "All of them?" "All of them. I left the east marker set because the mechanism felt solid." A pause. "You're sure about the plate on the 3 trap?" "I sat in the snow for 4 seconds after, to make sure," she said. It held. He looked at her for a moment with that expression she was learning to read, the one that registered new data and adjusted for it. Then he looked back at the piece of wood in his hands. "There's coffee," he said. "I know," she said. "I made it this morning." She poured herself a cup and sat down at the other chair and pulled off her heavy boots. Her feet had been warm enough, thank the good wool stockings, and she felt the particular exhaustion of a cold, focused, physically demanding day settling into her like ballast. Not bad, not crushing. The satisfying weight of a thing done and done right. She looked across the table at the carving in his hands. A bird this time. Not the hawk from the collection under the shelf. Something smaller. A sparrow, maybe, or something like it. "You could put those on the shelf," she said, "instead of keeping them in a crate." He didn't look up. "They're not for the shelf." "What are they for?" A longer pause than usual. "I don't know," he said. "I just make them." She looked at the small wooden bird turning in his hands, the detail accumulating in increments under the tiny knife. "The hawk," she said carefully, "the feathers on it, the way the wings sit. You put real thought into that." He was quiet. "I'm not complimenting you," she said. "I'm just saying what I see, because ignoring things I see is not something I do." He stopped the knife, looked at the bird for a moment. "My father carved," he said. It was the one thing he did without being angry about it. He turned the piece once. "I don't know if I do it because I liked watching him, or because I want to see if I can do it better." She understood this in a way that didn't require explanation. "Is that why you came out here, to be in a place where you could figure out what you were without other people's versions of you in the way?" He looked up at her then. She held his gaze steadily, because she meant the question, and she wasn't going to pretend she didn't. "Something like that," he said. After a moment he added, "It took longer than I thought." "Those things usually do," she said. December deepened into something beyond weather and into something closer to a condition, an ambient, constant pressure that shaped every decision and every movement. The days shortened until the usable light was barely 6 hours, and she organized everything around those 6 hours with a precision that would have seemed obsessive in any other context, and here was simply necessary. The animals were checked and fed at first light. The water was hauled. The wood box was maintained. The food stores were inventoried every 3 days because she'd learned in the second week that not knowing exactly what you had was a form of vulnerability she couldn't afford. Silas was back on the lines within 4 days of the knee episode, moving more carefully than before, and she didn't argue with this because she'd learned which arguments were useful and which were not. What she did instead was shift her own schedule to intersect with his return time in the evenings, so that she was always in the cabin when he came back, and she always had the water barrel topped up and the supper started, so that the only thing he had to do when he came through the door was stop moving. She was not doing this because she felt it was her role. She was doing it because she'd done the math on their combined capacity and understood that optimizing his recovery was the most efficient use of her time in those evening hours. This was the story she told herself, and it was mostly true. In the 3rd week of December, they butchered the younger of the 2 pigs that had been in the shed since October. This was not something she'd done before. She was aware that she had not done it before, and that her awareness of this fact was not going to be relevant to whether it needed doing. So she told him she hadn't done it and asked him to talk her through it first. And he did, matter-of-factly, in the same register he used for everything practical. And she listened, and then she did it. It was hard. Not physically only, but in the other way that hard things are hard. When you are doing something that has consequences and cannot be undone and requires a steadiness that has to be chosen rather than felt. She chose it. She was not steady the entire time. There was a moment about halfway through where she stopped and breathed through her nose for a count of 7 and stared at the shed wall until the moment passed. But she was steady enough, and she did the job correctly, and when it was done she washed her hands in the snow outside the shed and then leaned against the shed wall for a moment and let the cold air do what it needed to. Silas came out of the shed behind her and stood beside her. She said, "I need a minute." "Take it," he said. He didn't go back inside. He just stood there beside her in the cold, not speaking, while she took her minute. Then another. She didn't know exactly how long it was before she straightened and said, "All right." And he said, "All right." And they went back into the next part of the work. She thought about that later. The standing there. She thought about how, in the mill and in the rented room where her mother died, and in every other difficult place she'd been before this, she'd had to take her difficult minutes entirely alone. Not because people weren't present, but because being present with someone in a hard minute required a kind of quiet attentiveness that most people didn't know how to offer. They'd fill it. They'd comfort, which was a different thing. They'd minimize or escalate or redirect. He just stood there. It was such a small thing, and it was such an enormous thing, and she wasn't ready to examine what that meant. The week between Christmas and New Year's, though those dates were largely theoretical up here, observed primarily by her marking them in her head, was the coldest stretch yet. The temperature at night went to places the thermometer on the porch couldn't accurately measure, because it only went so low, and the wind came in gusts that made the cabin walls flex in a way that was unsettling, until she understood it was flex and not failure, that the logs were doing what they were designed to do. It was during this week that she woke at 3 in the morning to the sound of something she couldn't immediately identify. She lay still for a moment, listening. The fire was low. She'd been banking it better now, but in this cold it went through wood faster than normal. The wind was at a lull. The cabin was quiet. The sound came again. From behind the curtain. Not a call for help. Not a word. Just a sound that a person makes when pain has found them in their sleep and the body responds before the mind has gotten there. She got up. Her feet hit the cold floor and she kept moving anyway, gathering the wool blanket off her bunk. She crossed to the curtain and said quietly, "Silas?" A pause. Then, in a voice that was controlled and clearly constructed on the fly, "I'm fine." "I know you know the words," she said. "Is the leg?" Another pause. "Yes." She pulled the curtain aside. The sleeping area was dark except for the ambient red glow from the stove damper, barely enough to see by. He was sitting up on the edge of his bunk, the legs stretched out in front of him, and even in the dim light she could see the set of his shoulders that she recognized from the night he'd come back from the North Slope, the specific architecture of a person managing pain without anyone to help. She didn't ask permission. She crouched and started working the muscle the way she'd learned, and he said nothing because they had long since passed the point where he was going to argue with her about things that were practically obvious, and she was glad of that. He was warm, warmer than he should be. She noted this and filed it. "How long has the leg been like this tonight?" she said. "A few hours." "You should have—" "I know," he said. "I know I should have." She worked in silence for a while. The stove ticked. The wind moved outside. She pressed her thumb into the knot of muscle and felt it slowly, grudgingly, release, degree by degree. "You have a fever," she said. He didn't deny it. "It's not bad." "I'll decide that." She finished the wrap and straightened. The muscles releasing. "Is there anything else? Anywhere else?" A pause that went on slightly too long. "My back, where I hit the ground on the North Slope, I didn't think—" "You didn't tell me you hit the ground." "I didn't fall all the way. I caught myself on the—" "You didn't tell me," she said again, steadily. Not angry. Something more contained than anger. He was quiet. "No," he said. "I didn't." She made him tell her where and how, and she checked what she could check in the poor light, and the back was bruised extensively, but nothing felt wrong in the way that wrong had a particular quality when it came to bodies. She'd learned this from tending her mother in the last months. The fever was the thing that worried her. Fevers up here, in winter, with the nearest doctor 3 hours' ride through snow and ice. Fevers were the variable that could change everything in a short time. She rebuilt the fire properly, not banked, built, high enough to warm the space quickly, and boiled water for willow bark tea, which he'd shown her in the first weeks, and which she'd paid careful attention to because she'd understood even then that there would come a moment when she'd need to know it without him standing next to her. She made him drink it. He drank it without argument, which told her the fever was worse than he'd said. "You need to sleep," she said. "I'll be on the lines in the morning." "You won't." He looked at her in the firelight. "You won't," she said again, with exactly the same inflection. "Because you have a fever and a bruised back and the leg cramped twice tonight, and you need at least one day for the willow bark to work and the fever to break. And I will run the lines tomorrow and the next day if I need to." She sat back. "This is not negotiable, Silas." A long moment. He looked at her the way he sometimes did when she'd said something that landed in a way he wasn't prepared for. That quality of reassessment, the update to the internal calculation. "You can't run all the lines," he said. "The full circuit is, tell me which ones matter most and I'll prioritize. Talk me through the south set." "I haven't done that one alone." He talked her through the south set. She listened. She asked the questions that needed asking. She made marks on the flour sack map. Then she said, "Sleep. If the fever isn't down by evening, I'm going to need you to tell me what else is in that medical crate, because I'm going to go through it looking for things I might need, and I'd rather know what I'm looking at." He slept. She went back to her bunk, but not to sleep, lying in the dark, listening to the altered rhythm of his breathing behind the curtain. The slightly too fast quality of a body working against something, the occasional shift of a person whose comfort is disrupted by more than just cold. She ran the lines for 4 days. Not perfectly. On the second day, she made a wrong turn on the south set because the snow had covered one of the markers, and she had to backtrack a quarter-mile in the wind, which cost her 40 minutes and some dignity. On the third day, the number 3 trap misfired again. Not when her hands were in it, but just after she'd finished the set, snapping shut on empty air with a sound like a rifle shot that made her step back so fast she nearly went over backward. She stood in the snow and said one word that she had never in her life said in front of another person. And then she reset the trap more carefully and moved on. She brought back reasonable hauls all 4 days. Not as good as his best days. She didn't have his eye for the animal patterns yet, didn't know by instinct which sets were likely to be productive and which were going through the motions. But enough. Enough to matter. The fever broke on the third night. She heard it break. The quality of his breathing changed in the small hours, went easier and longer. And when she checked on him in the morning, he was cooler and awake and looked for the first time since it had started, like himself. He looked at her when she came in and said, "You look like you've been running lines in December." 4 days' worth, she said. He was quiet for a moment. "How'd the south set look?" The third marker from the top of the ridge was under snow. "You'll want to reset it higher before the next storm." He nodded. "And the 3 trap?" "I reset it 4 times. Once it misfired. I said a word I won't repeat." Something happened in his face that was, she was now fairly certain, as close as Silas Mercer came to actually laughing. It didn't fully surface. It was more like the landscape of a laugh visible under a thin layer of something else. But it was there. "Which word?" "The short one," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "I've said that word in front of that trap more times than I can count," he said. "I believe you completely," she said. She made him eat before he was fully upright, because she'd learned that putting food in front of him and walking away was more effective than asking whether he wanted it, and then she let him get up at his own pace while she went to see to the animals. When she came back, he was at the table with the carving tools, the sparrow from 2 weeks ago nearly finished, and she poured 2 cups of coffee and set one at his elbow and sat down across from him. "I need to tell you something," she said. He set down the bird. Waited. The east set on the far line, past the second marker where the creek bends. There's a section of the bank that's undercut badly. You probably know it. But I'm telling you because I don't think you know how bad it's gotten with the freeze-thaw cycle this month. It moved, visibly, while I was standing on it. She held his gaze. You need to add 10 feet to your route around that section, maybe 15. He thought about it. Since when? I noticed a change on the second day. By the 4th day, it was clearly different. I'll show you when you're on the lines again. You noticed a change from one day to the next. I look at things, she said. He picked up the carving, turned it once. Yes, he said. You do. They sat in a quiet that had been through something together and was different for it. Not warmer exactly, but more solid, more settled. The the way a door fits its frame better after a house has finished settling. Outside the window, the January sky was doing what January skies did up here. Building toward the next thing, always building toward the next thing, never giving you more than a day or two before the next test. She'd stopped being afraid of the next test somewhere in those 4 days. Not because the tests had gotten easier, but because she'd found out what she was made of, in the specific way you can only find out by being required to use it, and what she was made of turned out to be sufficient. Not perfect, not exceptional. Sufficient and sufficiency, she was learning, was the thing that actually mattered when the mountain was serious about testing you. She looked at the map on the flour sack, the marks she'd made, the lines she knew now in her feet and her hands and her frozen and thawed fingers. She thought about the woman who had stepped off a train in November with $3.40 and no one in the world who knew where she was. That woman felt very far away. Not gone. She was still in there, still the foundation of this person sitting at this table drinking coffee with a carved wooden sparrow and a recovering trapper and a winter that still had 6 weeks of serious intent in it. But different, revised. The way anything gets revised by being used in conditions it was never designed for and finding out that it holds anyway. Silas was looking at the sparrow in his hands. The last few details were going in. Something around the eye, something in the set of the tail. And she watched his hands work and thought about Pennsylvania and a father who carved and was angry, and about a man who'd come to a mountain and spent 11 years finding out who he was without anyone else's version in the way. She thought, I am doing the same thing. Not on a mountain I chose. On a mountain that chose me, through a rejection and a cold platform, and a stranger who walked toward trouble rather than away from it. She thought, there are worse ways to find out. January was not done with them. Not by a long distance. The worst of it was still coming. She could feel it the way the mountain felt it, in some register below thought, some deep animal awareness she hadn't had in November, and had acquired it somewhere in the cold weeks between then and this exact moment. The lines were out there. The traps were set. The wood box needed filling, and the water barrel needed topping, and the animals needed their morning round. She finished her coffee and stood up and put on her coat. January kept its promises. The second week brought a storm that made the November one look like a rough draft. 3 days of wind and snow that reduced visibility to arm's length and made going outside for anything less than a genuine emergency, a decision that required real justification. They'd been prepared. The wood was stacked inside and out, the water barrel was full, the animals were secured in the shed with enough hay to last 5 days if needed. She'd made sure of all of this on the day before the storm came in, reading the sky the way Silas had taught her. That particular low and yellowish quality to the clouds in the late afternoon that meant serious weather by morning. They were not comfortable during those 3 days. Comfortable was not the word. But they were functional, which was the word that mattered, and the cabin held, and the fire held, and the food supply held, and by the time the storm broke on the 4th morning, they were both somewhat worn and entirely intact, which counted as a victory. What changed during those 3 days was harder to name. When you are confined to a small space with another person for 72 hours, with nowhere to go and nothing to perform and no practical task demanding attention, you find out things about each other that ordinary days don't surface. Not dramatic things. The small ones, how a person sits when they're tired but not willing to admit it, what they do with their hands when they're thinking, whether they get sharp or quiet when the walls close in. She'd learned all of these about herself a long time ago. She was learning them about him now. He got quiet. Not his usual quiet, which was chosen and deliberate. This was the quiet of a man who had spent years in his own company and for whom other people's sustained presence had a wearing quality, not because he disliked her specifically, but because he was simply unused to it, the way a muscle is unused to a particular motion. She watched this happen and didn't push against it. She read chess. He had a small collection of books on the highest shelf, practical ones mostly, but including a battered copy of Thoreau and a natural history of the American West that she worked through methodically and found genuinely interesting. She mended things. She reorganized the supply shelf in a way that made more logical sense to her, noting which items were low and making a list on the flour sack map's reverse side for the spring supply run. On the second night of the storm, he brought out the carvings. Not just the sparrow, which was finished now and sat on the shelf above the stove where she'd moved it one day without asking, and he hadn't moved it back. He brought out the ones from the crate under the bottom shelf. The hawk, the deer, the fish, all of them. and set them on the table between the lamp and the stove where the light hit them properly, and she sat across from him and looked at them. "The dear," she said, "the way the head is turned. You caught something in that." "The angle of the neck," he said. "It took me 3 tries to get it right. The first 2 looked like the deer was confused. The third one looked like it was deciding something." "That's exactly what it looks like," she said. "What made the difference?" He picked it up and turned it. "I stopped trying to make it look like a deer I'd seen and tried to make it look like what a deer feels like when it's about to move. Different problem." She looked at him. "You think like that about a lot of things. The problem underneath the problem." He set the deer down. "It's the only way problems get solved. You spend too long on the surface of a thing, and you miss what's actually broken." She thought about the water barrel and the axe and the flour sack map and the reconfigured supply shelf. "I do the same thing," she said. "I just didn't have a name for it." They were both quiet for a moment. Outside, the storm continued its sustained argument with the mountain, and the lamp threw its circle, and the fire crackled its steady commentary, and between them on the table the carved animals sat in their various arrested gestures. "Eliza," he said. Just her name again, the plain version. "Yes." He was looking at the hawk. "What were you going to do if Cole had kept you?" She considered the question seriously. "Try to make it work," she said. "I'd made a commitment. I'd have honored it." She paused. "But I don't think it would have worked. A man who decides what you're capable of before you've done anything, that kind of judgment doesn't stay in one place. It spreads. You'd have figured that out eventually. I'd have figured it out in the first month," she said, "and then I'd have had to decide what to do with that knowledge." And I don't know," she said honestly. "I'd like to think I'd have done something about it. Found a way out. But it's easy to say that from here." She looked at the table. "From here I can see the shape of it clearly. From inside it, with no money and no options, and a Wyoming winter coming. I don't know." He nodded. She'd come to understand that his nods were a form of respect, an acknowledgement that she'd told him the truth rather than the version of the truth that made her look better, and that he noticed the difference. "The man you described in your letters," she said carefully, "the one who needed a capable woman to run a household. That was a real need." "Yes." "So why have you managed alone for 4 years since the last arrangement fell through?" A pause. Longer than usual. "Because the kind of capable I need is hard to find," he said. "And finding out someone isn't it after the winter started is worse than managing alone." She understood the logic. She also heard what was under it. Not quite loneliness, because loneliness was a passive state, and what she heard was more active than that. Something closer to a deliberate choice made from self-protection rather than preference. "You expected me to fail," she said. Not as an accusation, as a statement of fact. He was quiet for long enough that the answer was itself the answer. "Not fail," he said finally. "Leave. I expected you to leave." "When?" "First bad storm," he said. "Maybe before." She looked at him across the table. "We're in the second bad storm." "I know," he said. She looked back at the carvings. "I wasn't going to leave," she said. "I didn't come this far to stop." He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "I know that now." "You knew it before," she said. "You just weren't certain enough to count on it." He conceded this with a slight movement of his head. Then he picked up the carving knife and the piece of pale wood he'd been working on intermittently. Something new, she hadn't seen this one yet, and returned to it, and she returned to the natural history book, and the storm continued outside, and neither of them felt the need to say anything more about it that night. The storm broke on the morning of the 4th day to a silence so absolute it had texture. She stepped outside into it, 3 feet of new snow on the ground, the sky scrubbed to an impossible blue, the trees weighted with white, and stood on the porch for a moment just listening to how completely quiet it could be when the wind finally stopped. It was the kind of quiet that made you aware of your own heartbeat. She found it startling every time, this silence after weather, like the mountain clearing its throat before saying something important. Silas came out behind her. He stood beside her and looked at the snow and at the sky and at the angle of the sun, doing his calculations. "We need to get to the lines today," he said. "Both of us. The south and east sets first. The north can wait till tomorrow." "I'll take the south if you take the east," she said. "We'll cover twice the ground." He considered this. "Meet back here by the 3rd hour of afternoon. No later." "Agreed." She was reaching for the door to go back in for her gear when he said, "The piece I've been working on. The new one." She stopped, turned. He went back inside and returned with something in his hand. He held it out to her, not quite meeting her eyes, which was unusual enough that she registered it immediately. It was a figure. Not an animal this time. A person. Small. No bigger than her palm, carved from the same pale wood as the others. A woman. You could tell by the lines, standing very straight, one hand at her side, one slightly raised in a gesture that she recognized after a moment as the gesture of someone pressing a thumb into a muscle cramp. Working. Not posed, not decorative. Working, with the same quality the animals had, that sense of the motion underneath the stillness. She looked at it for a long time. "You don't have to say anything," he said. His voice had the careful flatness of a man who has offered something genuinely personal and is prepared to accept whatever comes back. "I know," she said. She closed her fingers around it carefully. "Thank you." He didn't correct her about the transaction. He just turned back toward the door and said, "Third hour of afternoon," and went inside for his own gear. She stood on the porch in the blue silence and held the small carved figure in her closed hand and felt something shift in her that she was not ready to name. Something that had been building in increments since a cold platform in November and was now, in this blue sky morning after 3 days of storm, suddenly too present to look away from. She put it in her coat pocket. She went for her gear. She ran the south lines efficiently and accurately and was back at the cabin before the third hour, which was a first. February arrived with a quality of sustained malice that Silas had warned her about in October. Not necessarily the coldest month, he'd said, but the longest feeling one. The one where the winter has been going on long enough that the body starts losing faith in the concept of spring. She understood what he'd meant by the second week. The cold was not worse than January at its worst, but it had a relentlessness to it, a day-after-day consistency that wore at the edges of patience in a way that sudden dramatic cold did not. She dealt with this the same way she dealt with most things, by breaking it into smaller units of time and addressing each unit on its own terms, rather than trying to contemplate the whole. Today. This morning. This hour. The wood box and the water barrel, and the south line and whatever needed doing between now and dark. One thing, then the next. She also, during this period, started asking him to teach her things. Not the things she needed to know immediately. She'd been acquiring those since day one. Different things. The trapping patterns. How he read the animal signs to know which corridors were active and which were quiet. The identification of the different tracks in the snow, which she'd been observing for weeks but now wanted the taxonomy for. What the mountain lion track looked like versus the bobcat. How to tell a foxtrot from a coyote. The particular way a rabbit changed its gait when it was being followed. He taught her these things in the field, on the lines, pointing to the snow and explaining, and she learned them with a thoroughness that she could tell surprised him. "You're not learning this for this winter," he said, one afternoon on the North Line, crouching over a set of prints she'd identified correctly at the first guess. "No," she said. A pause. He stood carefully, working around the leg. "What are you planning for?" She looked at the print and then at him. "I don't know yet exactly," she said. "I know I'm not going back to mill work in Ohio. I know that as clearly as I know anything." She thought about how to say the rest. "I came out here thinking I was starting one life, and it turned out to be a different one. I'm still working out what that means." He looked at her for a moment with that particular quality of attention he brought to things that mattered to him. "Do you regret it?" "Regretting it would require believing the original plan was better," she said. "And I don't believe that." He nodded and turned toward the next marker on the line. She followed, and after a moment he said without turning, "The second rifle. I want you to learn to shoot it properly, not just the principle." "All right. We'll start this week, when the light's good." They started that Thursday, in the flat clear light of a February midday, using a line of stumps along the south edge of the property as targets. I was patient about it in the way he was patient about everything practical, systematic, specific in his corrections, not praising when she got it right, but explaining precisely what had made the difference so she could repeat it. She was not a natural shot, which she accepted without defensiveness. By the end of the first session, she was hitting the stumps with some consistency from 20 yards, which he told her was adequate for protection purposes, which she understood was the actual point. What would I be protecting against, she asked, specifically. Up here? Mostly the mountain lion, if it comes to it, but there have been situations with men. He said this matter-of-factly. Not often. The mountain keeps most people out, but occasionally someone comes up the trail who isn't here to trade. She absorbed this. Has that happened to you? Once. Years ago. He checked the load on his own rifle with the automatic competence of long practice. It resolved without shooting, but the option mattered. She didn't ask about the details, and he didn't offer them, and she filed this piece of information alongside everything else she was building about this man, who he was, and where he'd been, and what the years alone on this mountain had made of him, and what, if anything, she might be changing in that slowly, the way water changes rock. Imperceptibly. But definitely. The third week of February was when the second serious thing happened. Silas was 3 days into a longer run on the north and east lines, a push before the next weather system he'd been watching build over the ridge. And she was managing the homestead alone, which had become as natural to her as breathing by now. She'd had the wood box topped up, the animals done, and the morning water hauled before 8 o'clock, and she'd spent the late morning making the first pass at rendering the last of the pig fat stored in the cold shed, which was a long and smelly and tedious task that she'd been postponing for 2 weeks and could not reasonably postpone any longer. She heard the horse first. Not Silas's horse. She knew that sound, knew the particular rhythm of that animal's walk, and the way the shed door responded when the gray was coming back up the trail. This was different, slower, less confident on the trail. An animal that didn't know this ground. She stopped what she was doing, wiped her hands on the cloth hanging from her belt, went to the rifle on the wall hook and checked that it was ready, which it was because it was always ready. She'd internalized that rule in the first week and never varied from it. She did not take the rifle to the door. She put it back on the hook within reach and went to the window instead, because showing a rifle before she knew what she was showing it at seemed like the wrong order of operations. A man on a dark horse, coming up the trail from the south. Middle-aged, she thought. She couldn't tell much else at this distance. He was wearing a long coat and moving slowly, not with the purposeful economy of someone who knew where they were going, but with the cautious uncertainty of someone who wasn't sure they'd taken the right trail. He saw the cabin and stopped, looked at it for a moment. Then he raised one hand, the open palm gesture of someone announcing harmlessness, and called out, "Hello, the cabin." She waited. "I'm not looking for trouble," he called. "I'm looking for the Mercer place. I think I've gone off the south trail." She went to the door and opened it, staying in the frame. "This is the Mercer place," she said. "What's your business?" He was older than she'd thought from the window, closer to 60, with the weathered face of a man who spent time outdoors but not, she thought, as much time as he looked like he did. Not a trapper or a rancher, something else. "I'm looking to buy furs," he said. "I was told Mercer had quality pelts. I came through Millhaven last week, and the man at the store said he did business up here." She studied him for a moment. His hands were visible. His horse was tired and not agitated. Nothing about him read as false, though she kept the assessment open. "Silas Mercer is on the lines," she said. "He'll be back tomorrow evening, most likely. You're welcome to water your horse and rest before you go back down." He looked at the trail he'd come up. "If it's all the same, I'd rather wait. I don't love my chances on that trail in the dark. I've got supplies." She thought about it. It was a real consideration. The South Trail in the dark, in February, with an unfamiliar horse, was genuinely dangerous. She'd navigated it in the dark twice, and she knew the trail well, and she'd still found it unpleasant. "You can sleep in the shed," she said. "There's room beside the animals. I'll give you something to eat." He thanked her, sincerely, and she let him water the horse and settle it, and then brought him a plate of food and sat across the shed from him while he ate and talked in the easy, practiced way of a man who'd spent a long working life in transit, moving from territory to territory, buying and selling. His name was Aldous Crane. He'd been doing this work for 23 years. He knew the Wyoming fur trade the way she knew the layout of the homestead's supply shelf, by use, thoroughly, without needing to think about it. He was not a threat. She was nearly certain of this by the end of the meal, and she was generally accurate about these things, as she'd been reminding herself since November when it counted. But she slept that night with the rifle across her legs rather than on the wall hook, because nearly certain was not the same as certain. and she'd learned the difference between those two things months ago on a platform with a hat pin in her hand. He was still there the next morning, respectfully asleep in the corner of the shed when she did the animal rounds. And she left him there and went about the day, and he emerged at mid-morning and asked if there was work he could do for his keep, and she had him split wood because the supply was not something she ever felt she had enough of, and he was better at it than she expected, working steadily through the mid-morning without complaint. When Silas came back in the late afternoon, a day earlier than she'd calculated, the weather on the North Ridge having turned him back sooner than planned, she met him in the yard before he reached the shed and said quietly, "There's a buyer in the shed, Aldous Crane, out of Mill Haven. He came up yesterday for furs. I put him in the shed." He looked at her. "You checked him out?" "Thoroughly," she said. "And?" "He's what he says he is. He knows his business. He mentioned 3 other trappers he's dealt with this territory by name. I didn't know the names, but I wrote them down for you." Silas was looking at her with that quality of attention again. "You wrote them down? In case you wanted to verify them later." He was quiet for a moment. Then he turned toward the shed without further comment, but she saw something in the way he moved, a slight ease, a release of the alertness he always carried when he didn't know what he was coming back to. And she understood that he had walked back up the trail from the north set, not knowing what he'd find, and that finding it handled was something he hadn't quite expected even now, months in. Aldous Crane turned out to be a fair buyer. Not lavish, but honest in his assessments, and not prone to the low-balling she'd half expected. He and Silas negotiated in the particular brief, dense shorthand of 2 men who both knew the market and were not interested in wasting each other's time, and she sat at the table with her mending and listened and noted the prices and the names of specific pelts and the grades and the reasoning, and filed all of it. Crane left the next morning, moving back down the South Trail in good light with Silas's first significant winter haul secured to his pack horse, and a handshake agreement to return in April for the rest. After he left, Silas stood in the yard and looked at the departing figure for a moment, and then turned to her. "You got a fair price," she said, "on the beaver especially. He started low on those." Silas looked at her. "You know what a fair price is for beaver pelt." "I paid attention to the conversation," she said, "and I read the price listings in the back of the trading almanac on your shelf. The one from 2 years ago. The prices will be somewhat different now, but it gave me a baseline." He was looking at her with something that had moved beyond reassessment into a region she hadn't quite seen on his face before. Something that was not yet an expression, but was close to becoming one. "When did you read the almanac?" "January," she said, "during the 3-day storm, after the natural history book." "You read all of it." "The relevant sections," she said. "I skipped the farming equipment." He looked at her for another long moment, and then he turned and went inside, and she followed, and he sat down at the table and put his hands flat on it the way he did sometimes when he was working through something in his mind and needed to stay still while he did it. "Eliza," he said. She sat down across from him. "The arrangement," he said. "What we agreed to in November. It expires in spring, when the pass opens." She kept her expression level and waited. "I said I'd stake you enough to start somewhere else," he said. "That was the agreement." "It was," she said. "I want to revise the agreement." She looked at him steadily. He was looking at the table, at his hands, with the careful attention of a man who is choosing his words with more precision than usual, because he's aware that the stakes are higher than usual, and he doesn't want to get this wrong. "I need a partner," he said, "not someone who works for me. Not a hired arrangement. A partner." He looked up. "Equally. In the business and the place and the decisions." She held his gaze. Her heart was doing something she chose not to comment on internally. "What does that mean specifically to you?" she said. "Equally. It means what you brought Crane's price up to stays in the accounting. It means the lines you ran in January count the same as the ones I run. It means if you have an idea about how to do something differently, we talk about it instead of you doing it and waiting to see if I notice." He paused. "It means the crate under the bottom shelf stays empty because the carvings are on the shelf where they belong." Another pause, shorter. "And it means I'd like to have the kind of arrangement that requires a minister, if you're willing." She looked at him for a long time. A real, considered time. "You're not asking me because we're stuck on a mountain together," she said. "I need to know that." "No," he said. I'm asking you because when I came back yesterday and found everything handled and my notes on the buyer on the table and the rifle ready on the hook, I realized I was more relieved than I had any purely practical reason to be. He met her eyes. And I've been honest with you about everything else. I'm not going to start being less than honest about this. She thought about a train platform in November and a man who had looked at her and seen the wrong things, and a different man who had walked toward her instead of away, and had, over the course of one winter, seen all of it. The knee that went down on the ice, and the words she'd said in front of the number 3 trap, and the flour sack map, and the comfrey poultice at 3 in the morning, and the lined-up carvings on the shelf where they belonged. She thought about what she'd told Clara in a letter, years ago, about what she wanted from a life. Not comfort, she'd written. I've never had comfort, and I don't know if I'd know what to do with it. Something real, something that holds when it's tested. She looked at Silas Mercer's face, the scar along his jaw, and the deep-set eyes and the beard that had its own opinions and the expression he wore now, which was the most unguarded she had ever seen it, which was its own form of courage from a man who had learned over 11 years to keep the doors closed. The minister would have to come up the mountain, she said, or we'd have to go down. We go down in April anyway, he said, for the rest of the furs. April, she said. April, he agreed. She looked at her hands on the table, looked at his. All right, she said. He nodded, the nod that meant the thing was noted and mattered. Then he stood and put the coffee on, because that was who he was. A man who marked the significant moments of his life by returning to the practical, because the practical was how he took care of things, and taking care of things was the deepest language he had. She watched him at the stove and thought, this is not what I came here expecting. It is not smaller than what I came expecting. It is not larger in a way I can easily measure. It is simply what is true, and what is true is what I have always tried to work with. Outside, the February sky was doing its February thing, building the next system on the ridge, promising more weather, more cold, more tests. The mountain was patient and enormous, and it would be both of those things long after they were gone, and it cared nothing for the conversation that had just happened at the kitchen table. But the coffee was on, and the carved sparrow was on the shelf above the stove, and the small wooden figure of a woman who was working was in her coat pocket. And April was not that far away. March came in like something that hadn't decided yet what it wanted to be. Some mornings the light had a quality she hadn't seen since October, a softness at the edges, a warmth in the angle rather than the temperature, the sun sitting slightly higher than it had through the brutal middle weeks of winter. Other mornings the mountain reasserted itself completely, dropping 6 inches of new snow overnight, or sending wind off the ridge that made February seem, in retrospect, almost reasonable. She'd stopped trying to predict it and started responding to what each day actually was rather than what she'd expected it to be, which was a habit she'd been building since November and which was turning out to be useful in more areas than weather. The trapping lines were winding down. The animal patterns had shifted with the subtle turn of the season. Not gone, but changing, moving toward different corridors, and Silas read these shifts the way he read everything out here, with a patience that didn't fight what was true, but worked with it. He pulled the furthest sets first, then the north line, consolidating toward the closer runs as the month progressed. She helped with the retrieval and the sorting and the final curing of the pelts, and she paid attention to every part of it because she intended to know this work as well as she knew the cabin routines. They didn't talk about April every day. They didn't need to. It sat between them as a settled thing, not a question anymore but a date, specific and approaching, the way a landmark looks different when you're walking toward it than when it's just a point on a map. She'd found herself thinking about it in the way she used to think about difficult mill shifts when she was young, not with dread, but with the particular focused attention you bring to something that matters and that you want to do right. On a Thursday in the 3rd week of March, she found the flour sack map while reorganizing the table drawer. She stood and looked at it for a moment. The charred stick lines, the marker numbers, the creek notation with its warning about the undercut bank, her handwriting on the back listing prices from the trading almanac, and Crane's offers on specific pelts. 5 months of this place, rendered in a piece of rough cloth and a burnt stick. She folded it and put it on the supply shelf. Not in the drawer. On the shelf with the other things that mattered. Silas saw it there that evening and didn't say anything, but she noticed him pause for just a fraction of a second when he reached past it for the salt. And that was enough. The pass opened in the 1st week of April, 3 days earlier than Silas had told her to expect, which he said sometimes happened when March had been inconsistent rather than consistently severe. They'd been ready for 2 weeks. The furs were bundled and inventoried. She'd done the inventory twice, the second time, cross-referencing against the price baseline she'd built from the almanac and Crane's spring visit expectations. And the horse and mule were in reasonable shape after the winter's relative rest. And she had her worn travel bag packed with the same things she'd arrived with, plus a wool skirt she'd mended twice and a pair of men's work trousers that she fully intended to keep wearing, regardless of what Millhaven thought about it. The morning they left, she stood in the cabin doorway for a moment before pulling it shut. It was not a sentimental moment exactly. She was not a person who went in for sentiment as a performance. But she stood there and looked at the interior. The stove with its familiar stiff damper, the supply shelf with its ordered rows, the 2 chairs at the table, the curtain on the wire, the shelf above the stove where the sparrow and the hawk and the deer and the fish and the wolf or ambitious dog were lined up in the light. And she felt something that was neither nostalgia nor relief, but something compound, something made of both those things, and several others she didn't have precise words for. She'd come through that door in November knowing nothing about any of this. She pulled it shut. The latch caught solidly, the way it always did, and she picked up her bag and went to where Silas was already mounted and waiting with the mule's lead in his hand, and she swung up onto the mule. She'd gotten considerably better at this over the winter, the mule having taught her its preferences through patient, consistent non-cooperation until she learned them. And they rode down off the mountain in the early morning light, the fur bundles roped to the horse's pack, the spring air thin and sharp and carrying something that was not quite warmth, but was the promise of it. The trail down was different in April than it had been in November. The snow was still present in patches on the north-facing sections, but the trail itself was clear, and the footing was solid, and the views opened up differently. In November, she'd been looking up at it where she was going, and now she was looking down at where she'd been and where she was returning to. And the valley below with its cluster of buildings looked small and navigable in a way it absolutely had not looked in November. She thought about the woman who had ridden up this trail on a mule 5 months ago, following a stranger, holding the reins too tight because she didn't trust the animal yet, looking at the drop on the left side with an attention that was closer to alarm than awareness. She thought about how that woman had been exhausted and broke and recently rejected in public and more frightened than she'd let herself fully feel because feeling it fully would have been expensive. She didn't feel sorry for that woman. That woman had made the only reasonable decision available to her and had then proceeded to work with what she had, which was what you did, which was the only real option there ever was. But she looked at her from this trail on this April morning with something that felt like recognition, the way you recognize, across a distance, someone you know very well. Silas rode slightly ahead, the same as always, the gray horse moving in its ground-eating walk. His posture was the same, the rhythm of his stride was the same. She'd memorized that silhouette over the winter without meaning to, in the way you memorize the things that represent safety, when safety is not a given. "You're quiet," he said, without turning. "I'm thinking," she said. "About what?" "About the fact that the last time I made this ride I was holding these reins like I was trying to strangle them." She heard something in his breath that was the low, barely there version of a laugh. "You were," he said. "I noticed. You didn't say anything. You figured it out." She looked at the mule's ears, which were doing their independent tracking of the environment with the same reliable competence they'd shown since day one. "Is that your general approach to people? Wait and see if they figure it out?" He thought about it, which she'd come to appreciate, that he actually thought about questions rather than answering them reflexively. "With most things," he said. "Yes. Telling someone something before they're ready to use it is just noise." He paused. "You were ready to use things faster than I expected." "You expected me to fail," she said. "You told me that." "I expected you to leave," he corrected, the same correction he'd made in February. "There's a difference." "What's the difference?" "Failing is when you try and it's not enough," he said. "Leaving is when you decide it's not worth trying." He looked back at her briefly. "I never thought you'd fail. I thought you might decide the cost was too high." She held this for a moment. "It was too high," she said, "several times. I just decided to pay it anyway." He turned back to the trail and they rode in silence for a while, the mountain giving way gradually to lower country, the air thickening slightly with altitude lost, the first real tree break opening below them. She could see the edge of Mill Haven from here, or would be able to, she knew, in another hour. "Silas," she said. "Yes." "When we get to town, Harvey Cole." A pause. "What about him?" "I'm not going to make a scene," she said. "I want you to know that. I'm not planning anything dramatic." She adjusted the mule's reins. "But if I see him, I'm going to speak to him." "All right." "You're not going to tell me to let it go?" "No," he said. "It's not mine to tell you." She appreciated this more than she said. Some things were better appreciated quietly. They rode into Mill Haven at mid-morning on a Wednesday, which turned out to be the day of the week when the town had the most people in the street. Supply day, she'd learn later, when the outlying ranches sent hands in for goods. She didn't know this when they came in, so she hadn't prepared for the number of people who would be present to see them arrive. She also hadn't fully accounted for how she looked. She became aware of the latter when she dismounted at the hitching post in front of the supply store and caught her reflection in the store window. Not a clear reflection, just an impression, but enough. She was wearing the heavy coat and the men's work trousers, and her hair was up in the practical wind-resistant arrangement she'd adopted around December and never changed back. Her hands, when she reached for the mule's tie rope, were visibly not the hands she'd arrived with. The knuckles rougher, the skin weathered, the grip automatic and efficient in the way of hands that have been doing real work for months. She did not look like the woman who had stepped off a train in November. She looked like someone who had spent the winter somewhere serious and come back from it. She tied the mule and turned around. Several people on the street were looking at them. She met the looks without particular expression, not aggressive, not apologetic. Just present, just there. Silas was already unloading the first of the fur bundles, and she moved to help without discussion. They'd developed this efficiency over the winter, the ability to work alongside each other without narrating it, and it operated the same way on a public street as it had in the cabin yard. The storekeeper, the same man who'd taken Silas's order in November, who'd been careful and prompt and asked no unnecessary questions, came out to help with the bundles and to confirm the storage arrangement for the furs until Crane arrived for the second purchase. He greeted Silas first and then looked at Eliza and said, "Miss Rowan," with a nod that contained, she thought, a slightly different quality than a nod to a stranger, like he remembered her, and what he remembered was not nothing. "Thank you," she said, because outside the cabin she allowed herself the word. They were settling the last of the bundles when she heard his voice. Not loud. It wasn't that kind of voice. Just carrying, the confident projection of a man who'd spent years giving instructions across ranch yards and expected to be heard. Harvey Cole was crossing the street toward the store, and he'd seen them, and he was not turning around. She'd thought about this moment in abstract terms, mostly in early January during the long evenings when the mind goes to things it can't resolve and worries at them like a loose thread. She'd imagined various versions of it, herself sharp and precise, herself coldly dignified, herself saying exactly the right thing in exactly the right way. None of those imagined versions had quite accounted for what the real moment felt like, which was simpler and stranger than any of them. He was just a man crossing a street, somewhat older looking than she remembered, or maybe she was just seeing him more clearly now. The good coat was the same. The certainty in his walk was the same. He stopped a few feet away and looked at her the way you look at something that doesn't quite add up. "Miss Rowan," he said, and then after a beat that lasted longer than it should have, "I'll admit you're not what I expected to see." "No," she said. "I wouldn't be." He looked from her to Silas and back again, doing some kind of arithmetic. "I heard you'd gone up the mountain with Mercer." "I did." "Through the whole winter." "Through the whole winter," she agreed. A small crowd had formed in the way that small-town crowds form. Not rushing, not obviously watching, but gravitating. The way iron filings move toward a magnet when you're not quite paying attention. She was aware of it and chose not to adjust anything about herself on its account. Cole had the look of a man who is searching for the version of this conversation that reflects well on him and is not finding it readily. "I misjudged the situation," he said finally. "In November. I'll say that plainly." "You didn't misjudge the situation," she said. "You misjudged me. They're different things." She said it without heat. It was simply what was true, and she'd gotten very good, over the winter, at saying what was true in the same register she'd use for any other fact. The situation was exactly what it appeared to be. A woman who'd traveled a long distance on limited resources to honor an agreement. You looked at that and you saw a liability because I was smaller than you expected. You never asked what I could do. You never asked what I'd already done to get there. You looked at the outside of the thing and made your judgment and closed the door. Cole was quiet. She could see him working out whether to defend himself, and she watched him decide against it, which was either wisdom or the presence of the audience, and she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge she couldn't be sure which. "I was wrong," he said. The words came out with the slight stiffness of a man who doesn't say them often, which didn't make them less true. "Yes," she said. "You were." She looked at him steadily for a moment. "I'm not telling you this to embarrass you. I'm telling you because you have a ranch that needs running, and at some point you're going to be looking at another woman on another platform and making the same calculation, and I'd like that calculation to include more than what she weighs." She paused. "Character is not visible from the outside. You should know that by now." The silence that followed lasted several seconds. Around them, the loose crowd on the street was very quiet in the way that people get quiet when they're listening carefully to something they don't want to be visibly listening to. Harvey Cole looked at her for a long moment. And then he did something she hadn't expected, which was to nod. Not the curt efficiency nod of November, but something slower and with more weight to it. "That's fair," he said. "That's more than fair." She'd thought she might feel something large when this moment came. Satisfaction, or the particular release of a long-held tension. What she actually felt was smaller and quieter than that. Something closer to completion. The way a sentence feels when the last word lands correctly and the period follows. "Good luck with your ranch, Mr. Cole," she said, and meant it without irony, because she genuinely bore him no sustained ill will, which was something she'd worked out somewhere in January and found, to her mild surprise, was actually true. She turned back to the hitching post and checked the mule's tie rope, which didn't need checking but gave her something to do with her hands for a moment. And when she turned back around, Cole had crossed to the other side of the street, and the loose crowd had dispersed back into its ordinary business. And Silas was standing by the gray horse watching her with the particular steady quality of his attention that she'd learned meant he was making note of something. "You said you weren't going to make a scene," he said. "I didn't make a scene," she said. "That was a conversation." He looked at the street where Cole had been and back at her. "It was," he said. "A good one." They found the minister that afternoon. He was not what she'd imagined. A small, energetic man in his 60s with the practical manner of someone who'd been doing frontier ministry long enough to shed any expectations about the circumstances in which he was required to perform it. He took their information, asked the necessary questions, looked between them with the alert attention of a man who'd married enough couples to know the difference between ones who were certain and ones who were hoping to be, and appeared to reach a conclusion about which category applied. "You want it done now or Sunday?" he said. She looked at Silas. Silas looked at her. "Now," they said in unison, which surprised them both slightly. The minister smiled. "That's usually the right answer," he said. It was not a long ceremony, and it was not a decorated one. There were no flowers, because April in Wyoming was not a month that offered flowers readily. There was no music. The storekeeper's wife, a practical-looking woman named Ruth, who had the competent air of someone who could turn her hand to anything a situation required, witnessed alongside the minister's assistant, and the four of them stood in the minister's front room in the late afternoon light, and the words were said, and that was that. What she remembered afterward, more than the words or the room, was the moment Silas took her hand. Not for the ceremony, before it, while they were still arranging themselves in the small space. He just reached over and took her hand, briefly, and held it, and she felt in that grip the whole winter. The fever at 3 in the morning, the number 3 trap, the carved figure in her coat pocket, the flour sack map, the standing outside the shed while she took her difficult minute, all of it in the press of one rough hand that knew exactly what it had been through alongside her. Then the minister started speaking and Silas let go, because that was who he was, practical, unsentimental in presentation, deeply the opposite of that where it counted. They ate supper at the only eating establishment in Millhaven, a narrow room with 6 tables run by a woman who cooked without fuss and served without ceremony, and it was the first meal either of them had eaten that they hadn't cooked themselves since November, and it tasted, for that reason, extraordinary. What do you want to do with the money from the spring sale? She said over the food. After supplies. He had his coffee and the faint look of a man who has had an unexpectedly large day. Some of it needs to go back into equipment. 2 of the traps need replacing. I've been keeping the 3 trap past its useful life. Past its useful life is an understatement, she said. What else? More animals. Another pig at minimum. Maybe a second mule if we can find the right one. He looked at her. You had something. She had been thinking about this since February, in the gaps between other thinking. Better food stores, she said, specifically a wider variety. We ran low on things we shouldn't have run low on because the supply list was built for one person who wasn't home much. We need a different list. She paused. And a proper writing surface. I used the back of a flour sack and a burnt stick for 5 months. It worked, but it shouldn't be the system. He looked at her steadily. That's all practical. I know it's practical. You could have said something else. For yourself. She thought about this. She had not, she realized, been thinking in terms of herself separately. She'd been thinking in terms of what the operation needed, which had somewhere over the winter become indistinguishable from what she needed, because she had no desires that existed outside the context of what they were building, which was either a sign that she'd found the right place, or a sign that she needed to make sure she continued to maintain her own axis of thought, which was something her mother had told her once, and which she'd filed and was now retrieving. Books, she said. I'd like more books. I finished everything on your shelf by February. Done, he said immediately, which made her look up. He was looking at the table with the flat expression that was his version of having said something he meant more than he was comfortable performing, and she recognized this and let it sit without pushing. What about you? She said. For yourself. He thought about it. Better wood for carving, he said. I've been using what I can find on the property. There's a man in Mill Haven who works with proper material. I want to go to him before we leave. Then we do that tomorrow morning, she said, before we get the supplies. He nodded. She ate the rest of her meal. He drank his coffee. They were not, she thought, a couple who would spend their lives completing each other's sentences or performing their connection for anyone watching. They were a couple who would sit at a table and solve problems together and sometimes be quiet and sometimes say the true thing without the polite wrapping, and that was, she searched for the word and found it, plain and accurate, enough. More than enough. The kind of enough that compounds. They stayed the night at the boarding house, which had 2 rooms available and smelled of old wood and the particular collective history of a place that has housed many transient lives. And she slept in a real bed for the first time since October, and found it, paradoxically, slightly less comfortable than the bunk at the cabin. The bunk she knew. The bunk's particular complaints and angles had become familiar in the way of things that belong to you by use. She lay in the dark of the boarding house room and thought about belonging. She'd spent most of her adult life in places she occupied without belonging to. The mill town, the rented room, the train car. Places that housed her without claiming her. She hadn't thought of it as a loss exactly, because she hadn't had a reference point for what the alternative felt like. She'd known, abstractly, that some people had a place and a name in it, a spot that was their shape, that held them specifically rather than generically. She'd thought of this as something that happened to other people through circumstances she hadn't been issued. The cabin on the mountain, she realized, lying in the boarding house dark, had become that. Without ceremony and without announcement, somewhere between the first storm and the carvings on the shelf, and the flour sack map, and the conversation about problems underneath problems, that place had decided it was hers. Or she had decided she was its. She wasn't sure which direction the decision ran and suspected it might be both. They left Mill Haven the following afternoon, the supply run complete, the new wood for carving wrapped carefully and packed on the horse, the books, 4 of them, chosen by her in the small general store with the focused attention she'd previously applied to the trading almanac, packed in her bag alongside everything else. The trail back up was the same trail. Of course it was the same trail. But she rode it differently than she'd ridden it down, and differently again from the November ascent, which had been about survival and uncertainty and a stranger's word. Now it was about returning. She'd thought return required having left something somewhere, and she'd left the person who needed certainty before she could move, the person who'd been waiting for a door to open rather than looking for one she could open herself. That person had served her well enough for 26 years. But she'd been replaced, incrementally and without formal announcement, by someone who looked at undercut creek banks and wrote down the details. Someone who ran the lines in December and came back with the haul. Someone who had stood on a street in Millhaven and told a man the truth about what his mistake had been, without anger and without theater, because the truth was sufficient, and she had learned that sufficiency was the thing that held. Silas was riding ahead, as always. The gray horse in its ground-eating walk, the uneven rhythm of the man in the saddle that she'd have recognized now at any distance, in any light. At the point on the trail where Millhaven had been visible on the way down, that place where the valley opened up and the town looked small and impermanent, she turned and looked back. The town was already settling into the distance, the smoke from its chimneys going vertical in the still afternoon air, the shapes losing definition. She looked at it for a moment, thought about a train platform and 2 words from a man who'd never bothered to ask her name. She thought about how those 2 words had felt like the end of something and had turned out to be, with the distance that the mountain provided, something closer to a redirection. Not a kindness at the time, not anything she'd have chosen, but accurate, the way some things are accurate without being intended. She turned back to the trail. "You're looking back," Silas said, without turning. "I was," she said. "I'm done now." She heard the breath that was his version of a laugh. "Good," he said. The mountain came up around them as they climbed, the trees closing in on both sides, the air sharpening with altitude. The particular silence of the upper trail where the wind moved through the upper branches with a sound she had woken to every morning for 5 months, and which had become, without her quite deciding this, the sound of home. The mule's ears tracked and swiveled. The fading afternoon light came through the timber at the angle she knew, the one that meant another hour to the homestead and the stove to build, and the animals to check, and the evening work before the lamp went on. She was not afraid of any of it. This was the thing she wanted to hold on to, the thing she thought worth marking, even privately, even without ceremony. Not the courage. She'd always had that. In various configurations, she just needed the right conditions to find out. Not the capability. She'd been capable since she was 15 and standing at a loom. What was new was the absence of fear about what came next, about whether she was equal to it, about whether the next test would be the one that finally revealed her as insufficient. She was not insufficient. She had never been insufficient. She had simply been, for a long time, in places that had no use for what she had. The mountain had use for all of it, the problem underneath the problem, the notes on the buyer, the flour sack map. The ability to stand in a hard minute and not flee it, all of it, used, thoroughly, without any of it going to waste. The cabin came into view through the trees in the late light, same as always. The log walls and the shed, and the woodpile on the north side, and the lean-to with the empty trap lines waiting for next season. The stovepipe standing up against the sky. Silas rode into the yard and dismounted with his practiced economy, and she rode in behind him and did the same. And they stood for a moment in the yard looking at the cabin the way you look at a place you've been away from briefly and come back to, making sure everything held while you were gone. It had held. Of course it had. It was a well-built place, and they had left it in good order. And it had waited for them with the patience of things that don't need anything from you except to be taken care of, which they had done and would continue to do. "Animals first," she said. "Animals first," he agreed. They went to work. The carved sparrow on the shelf above the stove would be there when they came back inside. The flour sack map on the supply shelf. 2 chairs at the table and the stiff damper and the lamp that threw its circle of yellow light and the curtain on the wire that had been taken down sometime in February and not put back up because neither of them had required it anymore. Outside, the April evening settled over the mountain, and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky with the certainty of things that have always been there and will be long after everything else has changed. The past below them was open. The world below was available, reachable, present. They didn't need it tonight. Tonight there was the shed and the animals and the stove to build and the simple, serious business of a life that asked everything of you and gave back exactly what you put in, no more and no less, which was, she had come to understand this slowly and completely over 5 months of cold and difficulty, and a man who said the true thing without wrapping, exactly the right exchange, not comfortable, not easy, not the life she'd come here expecting, the one she'd earned, the one she'd chosen, with full knowledge of its cost, in the way that the best choices are always made. Eyes open, hands ready, not waiting for certainty that was never coming, walking forward anyway into whatever the mountain had next.